I'm joined, as I am each month, by attorney and local government expert Chris Hand to discuss current political news. Good morning,
Good
Chris.
morning, Ann.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to start with, what has been some really terrible overnight news, this plane crash um, in Washington, D.C., outside Reagan National Airport, where an Army helicopter collided with a commercial flight from Wichita. This is obviously a terrible aviation disaster from what we know. It doesn't appear that there were any survivors. Um, but this is an incident that actually is going to have some local connections through our former mayor.
Well, that's right. And first, Ann, I mean, obviously, everyone's thinking about and praying for the families of those affected. It looks like 64 people aboard the American Airlines flight who very sadly apparently lost their lives. And, of course, the occupants, the service personnel that were on the U.S. Army helicopter as well, I think 3 or 4 individuals as well. And anyone who's ever flown into Reagan National Airport, knows that scene vividly. And, of course, just over 40 years ago, there was another highly publicized crash outside of Reagan National Airport involving an Air Florida flight in the early 1980s, right there at the Potomac. So there's some very sad history of aviation crashes and collisions at that airport. As you say, there is at least in the post collision period, there is a Jacksonville connection, and that is former Mayor Alvin Brown, who in early 2024. Then President Joe Biden appointed him to serve on the National Transportation Safety Board, which, as you know, investigates transportation accidents and disasters and crashes and those sorts of things. In December, right before leaving office, President Biden elevated Mayor Brown to the role of vice chair of the NTSB. We don't know, of course, exactly what, the role the NTSB will play. They often play a role in these kinds of incidents and who they will assign to that. But they're at least going to be one of the agencies that investigates that crash, and a former Jacksonville mayor is serving as vice chair right now.
And as we know, those investigations can really take some time. I mean, there's a lot to be determined. They do know that there was some communications that they can listen to, but, really what occurred and why is going to take some time.
It always does. And this is probably the most significant air crash that's happened in this country for more than 15 years. Again, happened right in the nation's capital. As you know, there's a lot of sensitivity in the nation's capital about the airspace and the corridors they use because of the government buildings there. So this takes on an extra dimension. I'm sure the Pentagon will be investigating. The Department of Defense will be investigating as well. In fact, the recently sworn-in Secretary of Defense said that last night, that there's going to be an investigation because obviously there was a military-involved aircraft in this collision as well. So a variety of agencies will look at this, but NTSB will almost certainly be one of them.
Well, a sad bit of news overnight. I want to move on to another topic that is also sad, but also had some celebration in it. This was the funeral of Sam Musa yesterday. I know you were there. I was there myself. Tell us a little bit about Sam and how he was memorialized by his family and friends yesterday.
And when you kind of look at the story of Jacksonville consolidation, as you know, I've had the honor to chronicle some of that history of Jacksonville consolidation. Elected officials are often the ones who receive top billing in that story, understandably. Mayors, city council members are often the ones who receive the headlines and the media attention. But when you really look at the history of our consolidated local government in the now more than 55 years that it's existed, I think the true protagonists are 2 people who also happen to be colleagues and good friends. And the first one was Lex Hester, who was the executive director of the effort that created our consolidated government, served in the first 10 years of consolidated government, left and then came back in the 1990s to again serve in our consolidated government. Lex Hester was someone who was really responsible for laying the foundation for consolidation. And the other person was Sam Musa, who happened to be Lex Hester's deputy, but sort of rose from that to be the person for the last 25 years who I think is probably most identified with sustaining our consolidated government, helping to move it forward, evolving it. I knew Sam very well and had the great privilege to learn from him and get guidance from him. And I think what was interesting about Sam, government also often has the perception that it's bureaucratic and inefficient and unintelligible in the way that it communicates, and sometimes that's true and sometimes it isn't. But it wasn't true when Sam Musa was involved in government. He was a highly effective city administrator. He was clear and candid in the way he spoke, and he was no nonsense in
Boy, was
achieving
he.
results.
Yeah.
Well, he was. But despite that no nonsense exterior, Sam was an extremely generous person with his time, an extremely kind person. He mentored countless public servants and city officials, provided them his guidance, his expertise. I was very fortunate to be one of those people who, when I was at the city, Sam was a resource, but before and while I was there, was an incredible resource. And Sam would tell you how he felt. There was no sugarcoating, which was quite helpful to have that perspective often. He was a lion of a human being. He was a titan in our consolidated government. When that story is written, again, I think those, again, no disrespect to any mayors or elected officials, because obviously they played crucial roles, but the foundation, the bedrock, the backbone is Lex Hester and Sam Musa. And I think what they have some other, there's another parallel to both of them, which is sad and why we miss them. In October of 2000, Lex Hester very unexpectedly died at the age of 64. Sam was his deputy then and was elevated to the role of chief administrative officer. Well, obviously last week, Sam unexpectedly died at the age of 72, both leaving us way too soon and leaving a giant hole in the process of the consolidated city of Jacksonville.
To the question of influence, I mean, there were some very moving and lovely eulogies, including an extraordinary one by his grandson, just an incredible young man. But Lenny Curry, the former mayor, also spoke about their deep friendship. He spoke, and former city council president and current council member Ron Salem, who is his cousin, and they both talked about kind of the man behind them in very critical ways. Lenny Curry talked about how he was, helping him, in the early days, particularly of his mayorship, figure out kind of, the job and what needed to be done. Ron Salem talked about getting texts during, budget meetings where he was getting questions from Sam about things he should ask, and then later being praised for appearing smart for, having asked those questions. But very much kind of the hand behind the machine of government.
Well, one of the smartest things that anybody in government could do would be to take advice and seek advice from Sam Musa. He understood the consolidated government probably better just by virtue of the additional years he had in it, better than anybody in the last 55 years, understood government at any nook and cranny, but was not just in the weeds and sort of granular, a very strategic thinker, knew how to get legislation passed through council, knew how to build things. The Better Jacksonville Plan, the infrastructure projects that came out of that were really a function of Sam implementing what the voters decided in 2000 and kind of moving those projects into place. He was a remarkable public servant, a model public servant, and I think everybody in Jacksonville owes him, and of course owes his family, an enormous debt of gratitude for the time they shared, Sam, with Jacksonville.
Sure, and quite a show of that yesterday, a huge overflow room. In addition to this big church, many of the kind of movers and shakers of the city, all there, and then a huge funeral procession. So
It's very sad, but I always try to sort of look at these things, with some hope. And one of my hopes right now, Ann, is that Lex Hester and Sam Musa are having a discussion about how to build infrastructure faster or get a bill passed through city council. Really two titans, and we lost a really great one last week, and it was gratifying to see that incredible show of support for he and his family yesterday.
Well, we need to move on to some state headlines. If you're just joining us, we are talking to Chris Hand. He is an attorney and a government expert, state, local, every level. He joins us once a month to talk about what's going on at the state and local level. If you want to join our conversation, give us a call at 904-549-2937, or you can email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. The legislature, there was a bit of an insurrection this week. Very unusual for a legislature and a governor of the Republican Party, which have often been in lockstep.
What's so interesting about this, Ann, is that it's very much a back to the future moment in the sense that for years, Florida governors dealt with exactly with what Governor DeSantis is dealing with right now. My, former boss and mentor Bob Graham was governor from 1979 to 1986, and from talking to him, it was pretty clear that when he was dealing with the legislature, he would frequently have from members of his own party a lot of pushback to what he was trying to accomplish. That's because there's been a long tradition in Florida and of different branches of government protecting their institutional prerogatives and exercising their institutional prerogatives. Look, it's not lost on me that when you look at the Florida Constitution, the legislative branch is in Article 3 and the executive branch is in Article 4, actually appears before that. And there have been for years and years, Senate presidents and House speakers have taken that very seriously. In more recent years, we've seen more unanimity and more deference to the executive branch. So I think that's why for some, even though there's a long history of the legislature defending its turf and its prerogatives, seeing what happened in the special session this week was surprising. The governor does have the power under the Constitution to call a special session, which he did for January 27th. What was remarkable now, in the sharp turn from what we've seen in the last several years, is House Speaker Danny Perez and Senate President Ben Albritton immediately sending out a memo essentially saying no. Like, thank you for that suggestion. We'll meet as required, but we're going to handle these issues kind of on the timeline we see fit. They did show up. They did what's called gavel in, gavel out. They convened the special session that he called, and then they adjourned the special session that he called and launched their own special session with their own immigration bill, an immigration bill that would shift power from the governor to the Commissioner of Agriculture, Wilton Simpson, in the state. So it was a remarkable show of kind of institutional force that we haven't seen from the legislature in recent years, and I think that's why it's partially stood out to people.
Is there any reason that they gavelled in and gavelled out from a strategic or logistical standpoint, or was that simply a slap in the face to the governor? I mean, could they not have introduced their own immigration agenda under his session?
They could have, but I think that was it seems to me that was very carefully designed to make it clear that, like, the work we're doing here is not because you asked us to come do it here. We happen to be here, and we're now going to have our own session, and we're going to do that work. So I think all of it was calculated to send a message that the legislature is going to exercise its own independent judgment. So it's going to be very interesting now, and to watch how this plays out, not only over the significant immigration bill they passed, which DeSantis has said he's going to veto, and so we may be back here in March for an override attempt. But as you know, the regular legislative session starts in the first week of March this year. Obviously going to be a very different dynamic between the legislature and the governor than there have been in years past, and that's going to be something that Floridians haven't seen for some time.
What issues do you think that's going to be attaching itself to most consequentially? I mean, other than the immigration issue, which I'd like to talk about in just a sec.
I would say all of them. I mean, I think this is clear. This is not just a single issue. This is a kind of an across-the-board effort for the legislature to say we are going to sort of exercise our prerogatives going forward. I think immigration will be a big issue, and I think where you'll particularly see it is on issues like the budget. That is the biggest thing the legislature does each year, is to pass an annual budget for the state of Florida. The governor has to propose a budget. He'll give his State of the State address as they begin the legislative session in March. I think a lot of the fireworks that will go forward will relate to what does that budget look like. Not only how much of the governor's budget does the legislature accept, how much do they write their own budget, and then what does the governor do using his line item veto from the budget, and does the legislature attempt to override any of those? For example, one of the actions they took in the special session this week, last year, the governor vetoed a large amount of money that went to support legislative operations, paying for staff and other kind of needs like that for the legislature. It was controversial at the time. It wasn't clear whether that was deliberate or that was inadvertent. Whatever the reason was, one of the first acts the legislature did in this special session was to override that veto and put that money back in the budget. So I think the budget's going to be an area, as it used to be in the past, and will be again this year, going to be an area of major contention between the two branches of government.
You know, usually when you see infighting in a party, you would think that benefits the other party. But in this case, it seems that everybody is sort of working hard to sort of genuflect the hardest for the president. This is all about who is currying favor. You know, the act that they passed is actually named the Trump Act. Trying to remember what the acronym actually stands for in the immigration issue. I don't have it right in front of me, but tackling and reforming unlawful migration policy, the Trump Act. DeSantis saying that this is a weak bill. It's not as hard on not doing as much on immigration as he wanted. Also, appealing to what the president has indicated he wants to see.
Well, and that messaging has been very consistent from the legislature throughout. And I think it's important to remember the political context here, Ann. Many of these legislators endorsed the governor when he was running for president. Obviously, that campaign was not successful. He lost the primaries to now President Trump. And so there seems to be an effort politically for members of the legislature to realign with the person who did win the Republican primaries. And you've seen that very consistently in the messaging. For example, when the House Speaker and the Senate President sent that memo after the governor called this special session, the language of the memo was, we're trying to follow President Trump's lead. We haven't gotten guidance from Washington yet on the best way for states can help on immigration, so that's why we should just tackle this in our regular session. When they crafted their bill, they made a great point of saying that they had got technical assistance from the Trump administration in crafting the bill. So I think you're right, Ann. That's part of the dynamic. It's not a partisan issue so much as it is the legislature seeming to try and realign with the person who did win the Republican primaries in 2024 as opposed to the one who did not.
I want to shift gears and talk about a national issue, but one that will certainly impact, all states and functions, which was this question about pausing all loans and grants, all federal loans and grants, to allow for a comprehensive analysis to assure that programs adhered to the president's priorities. It created a great deal of uncertainty.
Well, it's controversial. It's going to be a legal issue that I think probably pervades certainly lasts for the foreseeable future because of the different ramifications. Just a quick reminder, the way that this works under the Constitution is Congress has the power of the purse. It's Congress that appropriates funds, that passes budgets. It's the job of the executive branch to then execute on those appropriations or budgeting decisions that Congress has made. Over the history of the country, there's been a little bit of a push-pull between the Congress and the president over those kinds of issues. For example, during the Nixon administration, President Nixon and his team followed a practice of times called impoundment, where they would refuse to spend money that had been lawfully appropriated by Congress. That obviously led to Congress taking action and essentially prohibiting impoundment through some legislation that was passed in the early 1970s. Fast forward now, 50 years later, this has become an issue again as the Trump administration has indicated it plans to challenge that kind of law on impoundment and wants to exercise more control over what funds have spent, whether Congress has appropriated those or not. That was sort of part and parcel, I think, of this spending freeze, which the way it was formulated was very broad, could potentially have affected any federal spending. Now, very quickly, people filed lawsuits on that, attorneys general across the country, some kind of nonprofit organizations, and a federal court has stayed that executive order for until sometime next week, so people have more time to sort of get their litigation ready. And the White House then sort of essentially said, no, we're withdrawing the order. We didn't intend for it to be that broad. It was supposed to be focused on certain programs like immigration. But I think you are going to see this continued back and forth. What that means is, that I think any organization that gets money from the federal government, whether that is a local government getting grants or a state government getting, distributions from the federal government or nonprofit agencies that receive grants, I think needs to pay very close attention sort of to what's happening in Washington, because regardless of how this debate over impoundment or legislative versus executive power in spending money turns out, I think there's no question there's going to be less money coming from Washington to state and local governments and to nonprofit agencies. We were sort of at a high during the pandemic because of the American Rescue Plan, some of the other sort of pandemic-era measures to kind of help make sure that various companies and nonprofits and governments had sufficient revenue. That is now over, and of course the Trump administration is involved in a budget-cutting, government-cutting exercise through the so-called Department of Governmental Efficiency and some other measures like that.
But I'm curious what you think happened. I mean, this seemed like the first time this administration was exhibiting some true internal chaos. I mean, they spent basically the first day walking back what it meant and who it didn't apply to. It didn't apply to individuals. It didn't apply to, certain kinds of subsidies for, health care. But, then they ultimately rescinded it. what who's getting out over their skis here? What do you think is happening that this turned out to be such a um, kind of confusing rollout?
Well, I think part of it could be, look, obviously the administration strategy in the first 10 days or so has been a bit of a shock and awe approach as it relates to things like executive orders. President Trump signed, I think, a record number of executive orders just on his first day in office, and that has not slowed down, much in the time since. There's continued to be this rollout of executive orders. I think there's a momentum that develops in that situation where you're kind of issuing these executive orders, and maybe they're not as precisely calculated as they need to be, and that may well be what has happened here. There's also a lot of cooks in the kitchen developing these kinds of things. It could also be that what they did intend was to have a larger freeze on spending, almost as sort of a trial balloon, and see what sort of pushback they got. Obviously, that pushback was substantial because it could affect everything from states being able to sort of provide Medicaid benefits to nonprofits being able to pull down on grants. There was some concern, could this affect Social Security checks and the payment of Medicare benefits for people who use that form of health insurance? So I think that, I don't know if that was a deliberate effort or it was just a function of, the kind of the momentum of early administration. But of course, that's why people utilize the accountability that exists in the federal court system. But this issue is going to continue to be an issue going forward. I do think, for example, let's just take the example of local and state governments going forward. I think local and state governments around the country need to get used to the idea that there is going to be less money coming from the federal government. And what money does come is probably going to have more strings attached to it, whether that's on the issue of immigration or other issues as well. That's something that every mayor, local government official, state government official around the country needs to be paying close attention to and needs to refine their strategy accordingly.
We've got just a couple minutes left, but I want to touch on this kind of trash clash that the city council had. The mayor, they were, in disagreement about what they were going to be paying a waste hauler, Meridian, and it ended up going to the general counsel, the attorney for the city, who issued a binding legal opinion. These are always controversial when they come out, a binding legal opinion, but it is an unusual decision because, like the Congress, council typically has the power of the purse.
Well, and you're right, and as just a very quick summary of the history, council, the mayor supported a 5% rate increase for this company, Meridian Waste. In December, council passed a 29% increase on a 17-2 vote. The mayor vetoed that, as is her right, and then council overrode that veto as its right. Typically, that would be sort of the end of the story, like everybody sort of had their say. The mayor's office asked the Office of General Counsel for a binding opinion on whether or not council's action was invalid. And it's an interesting opinion that I think is going to be sort of generate a lot of controversy over time. Essentially, what the General Counsel said is that the ordinance which allows council to set rates for waste haulers is invalid, but that the city can continue using it unless one of the branches of government sort of complains about it. The opinion was about separation of power. What powers belong to the executive branch and the legislative branch, and the GC opined that the legislative branch had exceeded its authority in this ordinance. I think part of the reason there's a lot of controversy about this, and for decades, City Council has been sort of, setting the rates of waste haulers through a process that's in the City of Jacksonville Ordinance Code, and been taking other actions like that. For example, it is under our charter, it's the City Council that's empowered to negotiate with JEA to determine how much JEA is going to pay in contributions to the city in lieu of property taxes each year. So there's some other examples like that. So it caused some consternation because of some of those other examples.
I mean, council is saying, look, we've been doing this since the 70s.
Right.
Why is it all of a sudden a problem? Why is it all of a sudden a problem?
Well, and that's something that I think again, because he's the lawyer for the entire consolidated government, the general counsel, I'm sure, will go before council and explain that opinion. But I think those are some of the sources of controversy, and is one that there has been that practice and been that practice in other areas of the charter and the ordinance code. Also because, again, the opinion says that the ordinance that allows council to do this is invalid, but that the city can continue using it.
Which I find the strangest part of the opinion is the general counsel says this isn't permitted, and yet I'm not going to stop you from permitting it. I'm just going to, on going forward, make a decision on a case-by-case basis.
If anyone raises an issue. So if everybody's fine, but then the general counsel's office won't address that. I think those will be the kinds of questions that come up and in that discussion, because you're right. Typically, if an ordinance is invalid, it's invalid, and it's not one that can be used going forward. But again, this happens about every 10 years in Jacksonville, as you know. We have some big, I love the way you put it, trash clash. We have that in some way here in Jacksonville. This is the version, I guess, in the 2020s that we're dealing with. But I think you will see that going forward. As you know, this has become such a contentious issue that in the last 24 hours, a couple of members of council have introduced a resolution of no confidence in the general counsel. That doesn't have the force of removing him or anything like that. There's a whole separate process for that. But that got a reaction from others. The Jacksonville Bar Association weighed in yesterday opposing the council's resolution, expressing no confidence in the general counsel. So we can certainly expect this issue to continue over the next couple of months while that resolution's pending. And, of course, Meridian Waste, which is the hauler involved, has essentially promised to seek legal action to make sure that the rate increase which council passed, which Meridian says is necessary to ensure its current standard of trash service, is implemented. So this issue is not going away anytime soon, either from a legal standpoint or from a waste hauling standpoint.
It is just one of those quirks of consolidated government that you have this general counsel that has to represent all of the branches of government,
right,
and do so even when they don't agree with each other.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's the general counsel has a huge scope of authority. Former Mayor Hans Tanzler used to say that we don't have a strong mayor form of government. We have a strong general counsel form of government because of that huge scope of authority. Mayor, city council, each of the constitutional officers, the independent authorities, but also for that quasi-judicial role, that they're not just a lawyer, but in deciding issues of conflict among different city agencies, they have the power to issue binding opinions. And
they sit as a judge.
Right. And that look, this is not the first controversial binding opinion. Every general counsel has, had controversial binding opinions over time.
Sure, I think we all remember when shall became may, or may became
that was a recent one in terms of city council and the school board. There have been disputes over bus contracts that were the subject of controversial opinions. If you go back and look, and there have been hundreds of binding opinions issued since Judge Durden was the first general counsel of consolidated government, there's controversy attached to many of them. This is the most recent, but this is one we'll be hearing about a lot. I think also, Ann, because the city's in a difficult budget situation right now, so conversations over budgeting and appropriations become that much more contentious. Add to that a legal opinion that members of council don't disagree with. Like I said, there's going to be a lot more to talk about this over the next few months.
Well, I look forward to catching up with you in another month, Chris. We'll be talking more about budget that time, and obviously a lot to unpack there. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Ann. Good to see you as always.